Hello, friends. Have you ever sat upright in bed at 3 in the morning and thought, what if I actually know nothing at all? When I was a sophomore in college, about a week before finals, I had a night exactly like that. Suddenly, everything I had memorized throughout the semester felt meaningless. One question kept circling in my mind. Do I know this because it's true, or do I think it's true because someone told me it was? I couldn't sleep until dawn. I couldn't read. I couldn't study. I just stared at the ceiling, questioning myself. The man I'm going to tell you about today went through exactly that. But not for one night like I did, for years. And he did it in the 11th century. No internet, no therapy, no Instagram influencers telling you to fly to Bali and find yourself. Just him, his doubts, and a vast desert. Today's protagonist is Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali. In the Western world, he's known as Al-Ghazali. 6 centuries before Descartes, he asked himself, what would happen if I doubted everything? And then made that question the center of his life. If you're ready, let's begin. The year's 1058. In the city of Tuz, in the region of Khorasan, modern-day Iran, a child is born. His father is a poor but devout man who spins and sells wool. In fact, the name Ghazali comes from that profession, Ghazal meaning wool spinner. The family has little money, but the father has a dream. He wants his sons to be educated and become scholars. When Ghazali and his brother lose their father at a young age, they are entrusted to a Sufi friend of his. When the man's money eventually runs out, he tells them, I have nothing left to support your studies. Go enroll in a madrasa, at least you'll be fed there. So in a sense, Ghazali's journey into scholarship begins with what we might call a scholarship program. But this was no ordinary child. Even in his youth, his intelligence amazed his teachers. He travels to Nishapur, one of the greatest centers of learning of the era, and studies under Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, the most celebrated scholar of his time. His teacher describes him as a sea-like man, the kind of student who today would be labeled a prodigy all over YouTube. Let me pause here for a moment. Whenever I studied history, I always wondered about something. Why do truly brilliant people eventually end up wrestling with the same question? How do I know what I know? As you'll soon see, Ghazali runs headfirst into that very question. But first, let's quickly climb the career ladder with him, because his rise is remarkably fast. After al-Juwayni's death, Ghazali catches the attention of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire. Who was Nizam al-Mulk? Not just a vizier, he was also the founder of a network of educational institutions known as the Nizamiya schools. In modern terms, imagine someone serving as both Prime Minister and Minister of Education at the same time. Nizam al-Mulk summons Ghazali and tells him, you are going to lead the Nizamiya Madrasa in Baghdad. Think about that. At just 33 years old, Ghazali becomes the head of the most prestigious university in the empire. If you're looking for a modern comparison, it's like becoming the president of Harvard or Oxford in your early 30s. Hundreds of students fill lecture halls to hear him speak. Even caliphs seek his opinion. His books circulate widely. Ghazali is no longer merely a scholar, he is a brand. And that's exactly when life throws him a devastating curveball. After teaching from that magnificent chair for 4 years, something inside him breaks. In 1095, at the age of 37, Ghazali develops what he describes as an illness, but not a physical one. He loses the ability to speak. When he opens his mouth to lecture, no sound comes out. He cannot eat. Physicians examine him and conclude, this is a spiritual problem, not a bodily one. When I first read this, I could imagine it quite vividly. A few years ago, I was about to give a presentation at a history conference. I was prepared. I knew the subject well, but the moment I stepped onto the stage, I was overwhelmed by a sudden thought. What exactly am I telling these people? Does any of this really matter? My voice trembled, my sentences became tangled. That's when I realized that sometimes it's not only your knowledge that can be shaken, your faith in that knowledge can be shaken too. Of course, what Ghazali experienced was far deeper than anything I went through, but I can recognize a small part of that feeling. So what brought him to this point? This is where the intellectual side of the story begins. And honestly, it's one of the most fascinating parts. Ghazali lived in a world where people believed truth could be reached through four main paths. The theologians, the philosophers, the Batinis or Ismailis, and the Sufis, the mystics. Everyone claimed, the truth lies on my path. So Ghazali asked himself, how can I know which one is actually right? And he took that question seriously. He began examining each path one by one. First, he criticized theology, arguing that it mainly reassured those who already believed and failed to convince genuine skeptics. Then he turned to the philosophers, especially Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, the great interpreters of Aristotle within the Islamic world. He mastered their logical systems so thoroughly that he eventually wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, a work in which he challenged philosophers using their own weapon, logic itself. The book became enormously influential. Even centuries later, it continued shaping attitudes toward philosophy throughout the Islamic world. Some historians even argue that it contributed to philosophy's decline in the region, though that claim remains debated and there's no universal agreement. After that, he examined the Batinis and criticized them as well. Finally, he turned toward the Sufis, and there he discovered something remarkable. There exists a kind of knowledge that cannot be learned from books. It can only be gained through direct experience. But to pursue that path, he realized he could no longer remain seated behind a prestigious lectern. That loss of voice, that inability to eat. It was his spiritual crisis manifesting itself physically. At last, Ghazali makes a decision, one of the most radical decisions of his age. He abandons his prestigious position in Baghdad. He leaves behind the salary, the fame, the status. Officially, he says he's leaving for the pilgrimage to Mecca. In reality, he departs with no intention of returning. He distributes his wealth, keeps only enough for his family's needs, and gives the rest to the poor. Imagine this, the most celebrated professor of our time, dean of the world's most respected university, wakes up one morning, leaves everything behind, grabs a backpack, and disappears. No social media, no explanations, just, I'm leaving. At this point, I'd like to share another personal memory. For a period of time, I stepped away from academia myself. I'd finished my thesis, but I felt a growing emptiness inside. Is this all there is? What do these papers have to do with real life? So I spent several months traveling alone across Anatolia with nothing but a backpack, far from libraries, learning through conversations, places, and experiences. Compared to what Ghazali did, it was insignificant. But I did get a small taste of that feeling, the urge to leave the desk behind and go searching for reality itself. And that's exactly what Ghazali did. He traveled to Damascus, where he secluded himself for long periods in the minaret of a mosque. Then he went to Jerusalem, then to the Hejaz, where he completed the pilgrimage. For years he wandered, living like a dervish, joining gatherings of remembrance under Sufi masters. For 11 years he maintained this life of searching, and something surprising happened. Those years of retreat became the most productive years of his life. During this period, he began writing his masterpiece, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Ihya Ulum al-Din, a massive 4-volume work. not merely a theological text, but a comprehensive guide to daily life, ethics, character, and spiritual development. Even today, it is read throughout the world and has inspired hundreds of commentaries. He also wrote a smaller but deeply personal book called Deliverance from Error, al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, in which he describes his own crisis. Reading it is genuinely astonishing. In an 11th century text, you encounter confessions so sincere they could easily come from a modern therapy session. Doubt overwhelmed me to such an extent that I could no longer trust any knowledge, he writes. He describes his inner state with complete honesty. The first time I read it, I found myself repeatedly checking the publication date and thinking, did someone really write this 1,000 years ago? Its sincerity feels remarkably modern. After 11 years, Ghazali is persuaded to return to teaching at the Nizamiya. But he is no longer the same man. Now he teaches not for prestige, but because he genuinely believes in what he teaches. He spends the final years of his life in his hometown of Tus, establishing a small lodge and training students. In 1111, at the age of 53, he dies in the city where he was born. According to tradition, on the morning of his death, he wrapped himself in his burial shroud, began reciting the Quran, and surrendered his soul as he closed the final page. Historians debate how much of that story is legend, but even the story itself beautifully captures the lifelong search for a conscious and prepared ending that defined his life. So why is this man still talked about today? First, because he earned the title Hujja al-Islam, the proof of Islam. This was no ordinary honorific. He succeeded in bringing together theology, philosophy, and mysticism, fields that often stood apart, and argued that reason and the heart do not have to be enemies. Second, and perhaps more interestingly, the Western world discovered him surprisingly early. His works were translated into Latin during the Middle Ages and influenced both Jewish and Christian thinkers. Some scholars argue that Descartes' famous method of systematic doubt, the idea of doubting everything in order to reach certainty, bears striking similarities to the approach Ghazali describes in Deliverance from Error. Whether Descartes actually read Ghazali remains an open question. There is no definitive evidence. But the intellectual echo across 6 centuries is undeniably fascinating. And third, Ghazali experienced something that feels deeply familiar to all of us. At the height of his success, he stopped and asked, is this really all there is? Call it burnout. Call it an existential crisis. Call it whatever you like. But here was a man who experienced it in the 11th century, and instead of running from it, he plunged directly into it and emerged with a legacy that still endures. Whenever I tell this story, I always come back to the same conclusion. Sometimes the greatest achievement is simply having the courage to ask, what am I really searching for? Ghazali left behind his position, his fame, and his wealth in order to pursue that question. Of course, none of us need to abandon everything and walk into the desert, but every once in a while, stopping to ask ourselves, what do I truly believe, and why do I believe it, isn't a bad idea at all. Have you ever had a moment when you questioned everything? Tell me in the comments. The most interesting responses might become part of a future video. And if you enjoy videos that explore the human side of great thinkers, don't forget to subscribe and like the video so you'll be notified when the next story about a scholar, philosopher, or ruler arrives. Until next time, take care of yourselves.